Hey, welcome back to Saturday Sportster. So where we left off last time was with mounting the gas tank, and today we're going to be working on mounting the seat. It's something you don't want. Welcome to another edition of Saturday Sportster. So for the seat, we're going to be using a River City seat. This is a 2-up seat that mounts in 3 spots, in the front, middle, and the rear. In the front, we're going to be using the lowbrow seat pivot mount that bolts to early iron head frames. It bolts in the stock location. It's really great because you don't have to weld anything else on. This perch should already be on your frame unless somebody hacked it off. But if you got this, this is great because you can bolt your seat right on and get you a good starting point for mounting your seat. It takes some springs in the middle because it is a sprung seat to give you a little bit of suspension. And then it also mounts in the rear, which also has to have a little bit of play so that when you're bouncing up and down on the springs, you don't break this tab off. Starting with mounting the seat, we're already mounted in the front. And this mount, typically all these mounts have slots in them, so we just have to set where we want the seat to sit on the frame. And with sprung seats, it's typically pretty important to where the springs are going to lie to the cross tube that goes on the frame. The springs we'll be using are pretty short, but a lot of them are much longer, and it'll look goofy if they're aimed forward or tipped back. They work the best if they're straight up and down. They have 2 mounting locations on the bottom of the seat pan, and I try to get those right over the top of this crossbar so that when I mount the springs, the perch and everything will sit nice and straight up and down vertically from the pan to the frame. So we're just going to line that up, and we see the holes in the threaded bung or the threaded spots in the bottom of the seat pan, and we're just going to put those pretty eyeballed right over that cross tube. It doesn't have to be perfect. You just don't want your springs to be, like, you don't want to mount it super far forward and then your springs are aimed forward. So just try to get those straight up and down. And then we're going to tighten up this clamp, which can be a little tricky. We're going to tighten up this clamp with the seat in position, just to at least get 1 bolt. And then we can lift up the seat to tighten up the other side. Okay, and that looks good to me. So to mount the seat in the mid location, we're going to be using these perches that are available at lowbrowcustoms.com. They have a couple different styles. These ones have threads on them. They have ones that just take a cotter pin, and there's a bunch of different ways to do this. There's some that even just bolt straight down. The ones that we have here have threads on them, which you can use to just bolt on. I'm going to show you later a different way to do that, but these are a bolt-on part as far as bolting the springs to them. They still need to be welded to your frame. We're going to be using this style beehive spring that's 2 inches, which I think fits well from the frame to the seat. And when you're measuring this, don't forget to take into consideration the perch height. But they also sell 2 to 3 and 4-inch springs, so you can figure out which one will fit best on your frame. But if you've ever used one of these before, you'll know right away that they are tricky to bolt on. It's hard to get a wrench in here to tighten up the nuts and bolt it to the seat. So I like to do things a little different when I use these, but they do bolt on, but they're just kind of a pain sometimes. So let's get these mocked up. That one looked good. getting good at this. Now that we got the perches on, I like to just kind of move the seat a little bit just to make sure, just to double check that it looks good. So the springs are going to sit vertically. There's a lot of slop in the spring, so you're gonna have to really make sure that the stud on the perch is centered on that, because the hole in the spring that you bolt the perch to, the OD of that is quite large. So just make sure to have that centered if this is the route that you're going to go. So now that you have your springs bolted on and the perches fit and everything's looking, say, the way you want it to look, I would lift this up, measure between center to center on the springs. You can take a hard measurement off the head of the bolts, transfer that down to the perches, and then make sure it's centered in the frame, or at least where it's going to land, the seat's going to look straight to your fender. And then after you have that, I would mark it, and also make sure that the orientation around the tube, that these are going to sit straight up and down and equal to each other. And also check that when you bolt them on after they're tacked, that they're still going to mate up nicely to the spring, and it's not going to pull your spring like out of alignment and kind of tweak it. So that's one way that you can use these springs and perches. I'm going to show you the way that I typically like to use them. So typically on the seat springs, they're just wound up like this and they don't have a nice flat surface. So I typically like to grind that off so that when it actually is engaged on the perch or the seat, that they sit flat. So I'm going to grind these, and then we'll machine a couple pieces to fit in here nice. You don't have to get crazy with this. I just kind of flatten it out just a little bit just to take that huge bump out of it you see here and make it a little bit flatter like that. And that'll help it sit a little bit nicer on the perch. I need to take a little bit more out. And that looks pretty good. A reminder, don't wear gloves when you're using this kind of machine. You don't want to get sucked in there. You'd rather get bit than get pulled in. And you'll want to flatten these out on all four sides, just that little bit. So now that we've ground down the spring to sit a little bit more flat on any surface that you bolted to, I'd just like to take away some of the slop of this hole. So, because this is the bolt that you're going to use to bolt into the bottom of the seat pan, this is what is already provided, and every seat's different, and a lot of the springs that you're going to use, even if you get them from lowbrow, the 2-inch and the 3-inch and 4-inch, some of them just seem to be a little different. I can do this in different ways, but for this spring, this is the way that I'm going to do it. I was able to find a bung that slipped into the top and slips in rather nicely. And this is just an 1/8 pipe bung that you can find in the fittings section that we weld in typically for oil tanks. But the bore that's through the bung fits this 5/16 18 bolt really nice. So I wanted to give you guys at home a really nice way to do this without having a lathe. If you have a lathe, you don't have to, clearly this has threads in it. We're not using them, so you don't need to put the threads in. But a lot of guys at home don't have a lathe, so I wanted to give you a nice option. So this fits nice and has a nice top hat on top, and so that'll take up some of the slop. And so we're going to be welding this to the top of the spring so that when you want to go to bolt it on, you don't have to mess with any washers or anything. We're going to be able to stick this with a long Allen right through the spring and bolt it right to the bottom of the pan. And so it'll be really easy. If you've ever had to try to put a nut on here and get in there with a wrench, it's a total pain in the butt. But there's not really a nice way to do it unless you either weld something to the spring or something like that. Because sometimes I'll even weld a nut, and these have studs that stick out, and I'll weld a nut right to the bottom and I just spin them on by hand. Or there's lots of different ways to do it. This right now seems to be the best way for this bike, especially to show you guys at home an easy trick. We're going to weld this on, and then for the perches, I don't always, just like before, like I just mentioned, getting a nut, when you put this in there, slipping a washer in there in between the spring and putting a nut on there and then trying to tighten it up with a wrench inside here with the spring is kind of a pain in the butt. And once this is tight to the seat pan, your butt's going to hold it tight on this perch, so you don't really need that. But I do like to take up the slop, so we're just going to take a piece of tube. This is just some 5/8 OD 1/8 wall tubing that we slip over the top, and you'll be able to just buy this at any kind of store, or if you have a lathe, you can machine this out. And we're going to weld this on and cut off the excess, and that's just going to sit on there and take up the slop, because once you're riding it, there doesn't really have to be anything to hold this on, because even if you pop up out of the seat's not just going to go flying, because it's also mounted in the rear. So this is just going to keep it on there just in location to the pin, just so the seat can't move left or right while you're riding, but it doesn't exactly have to hold it down tight with a nut. So we're going to weld this on to the stud and just take off the excess, and we're going to weld this bung onto the spring, which is just going to be like a top hat to accept this Allen bolt. Okay, here's the sleeves on the perches. I'm just going to tack these in place one time before I cut off the excess. And that's just to hold it while I cut them off. And the other one. Braze this bung on. I'm going to use the silicon bronze just because it doesn't really have to be structural, and I think it'll weld nicer to the spring steel. All right, we'll let those cool down and then we're gonna mount it on the bike. So as you just saw, I welded the top side of the perch and then cut off the excess just to take up the slop in the spring. And then for the top of the spring, I used the bung for 1/8 inch MPT, this top hat that you can get at Lowbrow Customs, and just silicone bronzed it around the edge. And I use silicone bronze because it flows nicer to the spring steel, and it really doesn't have to be structural because all the load is coming from the top. So it's never gonna rip off of this spring because it's not gonna ever be getting pulled apart. It's going to be pushed into it. So before we bolt everything up, we gotta take a couple measurements. So I've got my ruler handy, and as I've showed you before, we're going to measure from the center to the center of the other bolt by just going from the edge of the hole to the other edge, the same edge of the next hole. So if we do that, we're going from this edge to there. It looks like 6 inches. And that's just, we don't have to pull out any mics or anything for that. This is close enough. This is accurate enough. And so we want to mount the perches 6 inches apart on the cross rail of the frame. So I want to mock that up in that spot and mark it just so we know, and then we put the seat back on and make sure and just check everything before we actually tack them on, that everything's going to still work right. And sometimes if you come into an issue with, say, a spring not wanting to flex over the perch, you could just try switching the springs, because maybe how it's wound, because they're exactly the same. They're not spun backwards of each other. Sometimes if you just switch them, it'll take out any of the error that you might need. Or if you loosen it up and then just twist it around so that you're putting the coil in a different spot in relation to the bolt and the perch. So let's try that, just measuring this out and centering it on the frame and making a couple marks. So when we bolt everything back up, we know if this moved a little bit or where it's gonna land. So we measured the center to center of these bolts to be 6 inches. So to mount the perch on the frame rail in the same relation, center to center, as what's on the seat. First, we wanna get rid of these, and we're going to take a measurement on the frame rail. I'll be measuring in the center of the tube, and we're at 11 1/8. So quick math here, we want these to be 6 apart. So we're gonna take 11 1/8 minus 6, which will be 5 1/8. But we wanna measure to the edge of this part, so we need to take that out of the equation, and they're 1 inch OD. If I wanna subtract the thickness of the material, we're subtracting it from both sides. So 1 inch divided by 2 is 1/2 inch. So from here out, we're at 1/2 inch. So here out, we're at 1/2 inch. So all you have to do is subtract one of those sizes. And then if you take that away from 5 1/8, now you're at 4 1/8, and you subtract that or divide that by 2, now you're at 2 1/16, because you're subtracting it by 2 because that's per side. So you can take your square and move that to 2 1/16 and take it on the edge of the frame and then butt it up to your bung on both sides. And now we're going to check that. And the same way, if we go from the edge of the part to the edge of the part, we're at 6 inches. So that's 6 inches center to center, centered in the frame. So this is kind of a preliminary check because we're going to put the seat down with the springs on it, and these might move a little bit because I want to see where the seat is, say, the happiest. We also have to make sure that the seat is straight in comparison to the seat pivot that is bolted to the frame, because we do have a little bit of wiggle room in the slots. Not a ton, but there is still some. So we're going to mark the edge of both of these parts just so we have something to come back to. You could go around the whole bung if you want to, but just keep in mind they're not clocked in relation vertically on the cross tube. So this is just giving us an idea from the left to right plane of where they need to go. So I wanted to show you this again because it might have been confusing on the top of the bike, but this is just the top of the bike drawn out. So the black is the frame, the blue is the perches, and the green's the measurement. So to figure out how far we want the perches from the edge, with keeping a 6 inch center to center of the perches, we're going to take the outside of the frame, which is 11 1/8, and we're going to subtract 11 1/8 by what we want our center to center to be, which is 6. So 11 1/8 minus 6, 5 1/8. But we want to get to the edge of the perch because measuring off the edge is much easier. And they're 1-inch ODs, so it's a 1/2 inch to the edge of the perch. So we take that measurement, and since there's 2 of them, it's going to be multiply this by 2, so it's 5 1/8 minus 1, and that equals 4 1/8. So we want to get from this edge to the outside of the edge to make it really easy to measure from. And so we take what we just had, 4 1/8 divided by 2, which is 2 1/16. And you can take a really easy measurement using the square as I showed you from the edge of the tube to the edge of the perch and butt that right up to the edge of the square, and you're going to be at 2 1/16 from side to side, making the center of from the perches 6 inches. And you can use this, it's not just for this perch, but for lots of things when you're measuring holes from the outside of the edges to the center of the hole. And now we're going to bolt the springs on, which is going to be much easier now that we have these bungs in here. Just stick a bolt through the bottom, and voila. That's all it takes now. You can also use a flange nut to do the same thing if you have studs sticking out of the bottom of the seat pan. They also make bolts that have the same head as a flange nut, so you could stick that into the bottom of the spring and actually create a stud at the bottom of the spring using a bolt like that. So there's many different ways to do it. This is just the way that worked best for me this time, and also was a good tip with using the 8th MPT top hats. And same thing, it makes it way easier than trying to stick a wrench and get the nut to line up with the stud and put a washer on there and get a wrench in between the springs, especially since we're using these 2-inch springs instead of the taller ones. These coils are much tighter together, so it'd be really tricky trying to get a wrench in there. And then these are going to move forward. This one, see what I mean with it? Okay, might be able to relieve this by just rotating the spring around like I said. See how it twists so much? It's really hard to keep those things really in line with each other, so sometimes it might take a couple rotations. Okay, so that's centered on there, and that looks good with the fender in the back. So as long as we have these in that spot 2 1/16 away from the edge of the frame rail, and we place them so the bungs are parallel to each other, this should bolt up just fine. So we're going to do that. You can get everything out of the way, and we're just going to be worried about the perches now. Okay, first I'm just going to tack one in the position vertically how I want this thing to sit on the bike. So I kind of eyeballed it into being as vertical as possible and on the tube, and so I'm going to get this tacked in. And I was keeping it inside the marks that I have on the tube to make sure that it's still centered. I'm going to put the other one up there, and with just using a straight edge, I'm going to make these in line with each other. A straight edge and a couple clamps. I think I got to rotate that just a hair. And that should hold it into the same vertical position as the other bung. Yeah, that looks pretty good. I'm gonna get maybe one more tack on both sides. Just to beefing this up. Beefing. Might not be a bad idea, just loosen up your springs a little bit, and then you can, with it sitting down on there, you could actually rotate these, kind of spin them around and figure out where it sits best. And then maybe just bolt them on right there. There we go, and that looks pretty good. Now we're going to move to the back of the bike and mount the seat in the rear. And like I said before, this thing needs to be able to slide a little bit, because when you're pushing down on this, if you keep a lot of tension on the rear part of the bike, when you're pushing down on this part on the springs and bouncing on this, if you have it under tension on the rear mount of the seat, this thing's going to eventually crack. So we're going to make it so this can just wiggle a little bit back and forth, but never comes off the fender. So it just needs to have some type of shoulder bolt or something like that, just so the bolt can get tight so it can't fall out, but then it has a little relief so the tab can slide in that position just that little bit. I have a slotted mount that we bolted to the rear part of the seat, and I'm going to be adding a bung underneath with a washer just as a spacer and a shoulder bolt to hold this down in place. So we have this slot that is on top of the fender, and we're going to mark the slot just so we know the forward and back part of where our mount is going to land. This slot's kind of large compared to the hole that we're going to put into it, but it has to have a little bit of flex, being able to move forward. We're going to get that out of the way. And the easiest way to mount the center on something radiused like the fender, gas tank, anything that's going to have a lot of curves in it, you could get some fabric tape from any kind of sewing machine store, like fabric store, and you can get this flexible tape measure, and you can wrap that around any kind of part that's round to be able to measure from one edge to the other. So we're going to use that. Wrap it around the fender, and this fender measures 6 3/4. So the center of this is going to be 3 3/8, which is actually different from where I have that mounted. So it's just got to go over just slightly. So I'm going to mark the center, and then I'm also going to flip around the tape to just double check that we're actually centered on both sides. And it looks pretty good. It's really close. It might just go over just a hair. Depends. You gotta be careful how you hold the tape on the edge. Can't really get around. Get out of the way. Just double checking. That looks pretty good. And we also have to, we want to be in the start of the slot, but not move too far forward. So we're just making sure that if we go to that center, that we're not too, just give us a little bit of play. I'm just using this hole as a reference. And all right, and now we're going to take off the fender. We're going to drill the hole in the fender, and we're also going to weld a nut at the bottom to accept the bolt that we're going to use in the slot. That's a shoulder bolt. So we're going to remove this and go back over to the welding table. I don't want to get to drilling. Okay, first we're starting off just with a pilot because we just only center punched it and you don't want this to walk around. So I give it a bunch of whacks with the automatic center punch. Now we're gonna just go with a smaller size drill. I'm opening this up to a 7/16, 17/64 I mean, which is just going to be one size over a quarter, just to give us a little bit of slop. We're going to weld this flange nut on. Sometimes I like, when I'm welding these nuts onto, especially sheet metal, to use a flange nut because then you can have this nice edge to weld to instead of welding right to the edge of the hex of the nut. And they just sit a little nicer, like say on the inside of fenders. As before, I'm using a flathead bolt that is going to center the threads in the center of the hole. Gotta love that. I'm using silicon bronze again because since this is a zinc nut, it works nice on not burning away the zinc, so you don't really get as much popping as if you went straight to welding it, say with like a steel rod. There we go, and now we can put this back on the bike and check the fitment with the seat and everything on. So the next thing before I put my seat back down, I like to just tack, say, a washer on here because this is going to be sliding on the top of this fender now. So I want to give it a nice surface that I can clean paint off of and just control how much paint gets damaged from the movement of this seat, because it does need a little bit of flex and being able to move around. So I'm just going to tack this in a couple spots so I can clean off the paint, and then it just localizes the area of any kind of paint trying to get scratched to this right here. Give it a little spacer off the top of the fender after you have your nice paint job on here. So we're just going to tack this on. We're going to just tack it in a couple spots because it just needs to hold on to the fender. It's not like it's any going to load on this. And as before, I'm using silicon bronze. This washer is zinc too. And it has a lower melting point than the zinc or something like that, just so the zinc doesn't pop when you're trying to weld to it. Pull this out and we'll put the seat on here. And here's the shoulder bolts I'm going to be using. There's 1/4-inch threads here. It's a 5/16 shank, and I just have a little bit of a washer on the top just to take up any additional slop between the face and the top of the bracket, because the bracket's only 1/8. And we're going to be bolting this on just so that the bolt gets tight, but that it doesn't actually get tight to the plate, allowing the seat to move back and forth, which I'll demonstrate. Shoulder bolt in here and make sure that you line up the washer so it goes down. See how it's not tight? but it's holding it nice and tight to the fender. And now if you get up there and you just bounce on it, you can see how it flexes just that little bit, but tries to keep it in place. Because if you were bouncing on this and your seat was mounted securely to the top of your fender, eventually your seat pan or something would break and rip off, because it can't just do that forever. So keeping it just that little bit of flex will keep this lasting for a long time, but then it also holds it tight to your fender, because I've seen some people mount this without any kind of bracket, and now the bottom of the seat is just floating up in the air. So that'll be nice. It'll look good, but then it'll also work well. There we go. Now your seat's mounted. So the next thing to do, we're going to start working on exhaust pipes. I have a little bit to clean up though, and then we'll get to bolting something on. I'll show you how easy it is that you can bolt on a gas box set of XLR drag pipes.